everybody, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about the limits of using or engaging with non-participant observation when you are doing field work. So as a reminder, with non-participant observation, you are essentially sitting on the sidelines, all right? You're not interacting with people, you're observing, but you're not getting involved. You can still interview people, of course, but you're not getting involved in the day-to-day lives or the day-to-day events in that context in which you are collecting data, right? You're sitting on the side, you're taking your field notes. So this can be good for many reasons, but in this video, we're going to talk about the limitations of it and what you can do to mitigate some of these potential limitations. So let's get started. Number one is the effect that the researcher can have on the environment. So your presence, in whatever context that you're in, right? Your presence, particularly when it's, for example, I do work in schools. And so if I'm sitting in a classroom and I'm taking field notes, it's very obvious that I'm not normal, right, to that context. But if I was sitting, let's say, in a mall, in a food court, and taking notes and doing some non-participant observation, it would not be obvious, right? Because people don't know what I'm doing. I'm not I'm not sticking out as being weird or different, all right? So if you're in a situation where people know that you don't belong there, you're not part of the norm, and you're there taking notes, recording, etc., right? Then your presence may influence what people say and do. But the good news is that the longer you are there in that environment, the more normalized your presence becomes, and thus it can really mitigate that effect. All right, number two, how objective are you, really, right? We all have biases, right? We all do. We all have things we love to look at, things we don't like to look at when it comes to taking field notes, right? Our biases are going to direct our attention in particular ways. So you might be biased to documenting particular things or ignoring particular things or events, and you might not even realize it. And that's a normal human thing, okay? But this can be mitigated by having a clear procedure for when and how you take field notes and what you focus on. I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute when I'm done with number three, because my example kind of covers both the second and third point here. So number three, you can't capture everything. I mean, you just can't, all right? So if we think about the fact that I do a lot of work or have done a lot of work in classrooms, if I've got 20 or 30 kids and a teacher in a classroom, I can't capture everything, right? I can't capture what everybody's saying, doing, whispering, etc., right? And the good news is I don't need to, and neither do you, okay? You are going to miss things, all right? And this is true. The idea that you might miss things is true even if you're acting as a full participant observer, right? It's just you can't capture every single thing that's going on in that environment. But again, like I said, you don't necessarily need to. And this can also be mitigated by having a clear and explicit process with your field notes. So let me give you an example of how I work to mitigate the objectivity and make sure that what needs to get documented gets documented, as well as, how do I think about the fact that I know I'm going to miss some things when I'm taking field notes? What do I do about that? So I'm going to give you an example, going into an 8th grade classroom, and I spent, about 8 months in that classroom. And I was in this classroom for 2 to 3 days a week, right? So I'm working on becoming, right, an integral, normal part of that classroom. And within that classroom, there were particular kinds of instruction the teacher was engaging in that were part of this study. And so when the teacher was doing that, I was obviously documenting what she was doing. But then within the classroom, I did something where I did capture level data at the class level, right, with assessments and surveys and that sort of thing. But then I also had 5 students that I focused on and that I followed very carefully. Now, within a given observation, I cannot pay attention to 5 students. They're scattered across the room. They're going to be where they're going to be, right? So what I did was I made a field note I made a spreadsheet where I kept track of whose turn it was to be documented, okay? So I can focus on 2 students pretty well at once, all right? And then cognitively, I can't. I'm going to start to fall apart. It's not going to be good. And so what I did was I just listed them out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, had their names. And, for the first observation, I said, okay, I'm going to follow student 1 and 2. And for the second observation, I said, now it's student 3 and 4. And then for the third observation, it's student 5, but paired with student 1. We're going to go back to the top. So the pairings are not also always the same, right? because the first time through, I'm looking at student 1 and 2, and the next time through, I'm looking at students 5 and 1 together and students 2 and 3 together. I think that's right. Yeah. And then 4 and 5, right? So the pairings do shift periodically. So what I had to do with that was accept the fact that if I'm watching students 1 and 2 very closely, I might, right, be able to document some other work that some things that students 3, 4, and 5 are saying or doing. I might be able to capture that, right? It could be in a whole class context where, a student that I wasn't observing that day or focusing on observing that day might raise their hand and say something. Of course, I'm going to write that down. But if the teacher said, hey, I'm going to put you guys in small groups and, you're going to do your thing, I can't be going around to 5 groups, but I can go to one group and I can sit with, one group with one student for, let's say, 10 minutes, and then rotate to the next group where student 2 is sitting and sit there for 10 minutes. Again, I'm not capturing everything, obviously, because I'm not spending the entire time with them, but I do have a system in place that allows me to get a really good chunk of data, and it really helps me know who to focus on and how to focus my attention. And because I'm going into that environment repeatedly, any patterns that start to emerge, they're just going to build and snowball over time. So the fact that I might miss a little bit of something, over time, that's going to balance out, right? Because I have this really good system in place. And so that's what you really want. You want a really good field note data collection system in place. All right, and then the last point here, number 4, is whose voices and perspectives are included, okay? Because as researchers with non-participant observation, we're over there taking our notes, and yes, you might be recording things, which is also another way to make sure that you capture everything accurately, by the way. But you want to make sure that you're interacting with participants and gathering additional forms of data to represent their voices and make sure that your interpretation of the data is accurate. All right. So you're still doing things like surveys. You're still maybe collecting some artifacts. You're still doing interviews so that you can better understand the voices of your participants and make sure that those are a prominent feature in your study.